Dawn hadn't even broken when she left a loving note on the table and slipped out in silence. At work, everything seemed the same, until the whispers, the averted glances, and a breaking news report on TV changed everything. "How can he be in two places at once?" she murmured, her hands trembling and her heart racing. And in that moment she realized she might be the only witness capable of saving an innocent man, or of being crushed by the silence of the powerful. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Let's begin. The headlines screamed his name across every news outlet in Chicago. Michael Davidson, the billionaire CEO of Davidson Industries, a man who had built an empire that employed thousands across the Midwest, now found himself at the center of a scandal that threatened to destroy everything he had worked for. The business magazines that once celebrated him as a visionary now painted him as a villain. Television commentators dissected his every move, his every past decision, searching for signs of the monster they believed him to be. The accusations were serious and damaging. Michael stood accused of orchestrating a corporate conspiracy against a rival businessman, Richard Thornton, using underhanded tactics to secure multi-million-dollar contracts. The media frenzy was relentless. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, cameras flashed whenever his car appeared, and his old photographs were scrutinized as evidence of arrogance and cold calculation. The court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict before the first hearing even began. But behind this seemingly perfect narrative of guilt, there was something nobody wanted to see. Something that didn't fit the story everyone had already decided to believe. The truth was, buried beneath layers of carefully constructed lies, hidden in the shadows where powerful people preferred it to stay. Across town, in a modest apartment on the south side, Elena Martinez woke up before dawn, just as she had done every morning for the past year and a half. The alarm clock's harsh beep pulled her from the few hours of sleep she managed to get. She moved quietly through the small apartment, trying not to wake her mother, whose medication sat in neat rows on the kitchen counter. Elena pulled on her faded yellow cleaning uniform, the fabric worn thin from countless washes. She made weak coffee, checked that her mother had everything she needed for the day, and headed out into the cold Chicago morning to catch the crowded bus downtown. Elena worked as a housekeeper at Michael Davidson's sprawling mansion in Lincoln Park. It was a job that paid better than most she could find, and it allowed her to take care of her mother's mounting medical bills. She knew that house like the back of her hand. She knew the security guards' routines. The sound of the old elevator, the creak of the office door, which lights should be on at what time. She had become invisible in that house, another piece of furniture that people walked past without really seeing. On the night that would change everything, the night when Michael was supposedly across town orchestrating his alleged scheme against Richard Thornton, Elena had been working late. She remembered it clearly because it had been unusual. Michael had come home exhausted, much earlier than the prosecution claimed. She had heard his heavy footsteps in the foyer, watched him drop his suit jacket over the chair in a way that spoke of bone-deep weariness. She had heard him move toward the kitchen, rummage through the refrigerator for something quick to eat, and then the silence that fell when he retreated to his bedroom. But there were other things Elena had noticed that week, things that seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt ominous. Security cameras that were suddenly turned off, a technician nobody recognized who claimed to be there for routine maintenance, the time clock by the service entrance that mysteriously stopped working. Small details that a housekeeper might notice, but that powerful people assumed would go unobserved. The day of the hearing arrived with the weight of a thunderstorm about to break. The courthouse downtown was mobbed with journalists, their equipment creating a forest of microphones and cameras. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like flowers seeking sun. Inside, the courtroom was packed to capacity. People pushed and jostled for seats, the air thick with anticipation and judgment. Michael Davidson entered the courtroom flanked by federal agents, his head held high despite the weight of the chains that bound his hands. His face was composed, but his eyes held a lost quality that no amount of expensive legal preparation could hide. Next to him should have been Daniel Foster, the renowned criminal defense attorney known throughout Illinois for never losing a case. Daniel was the only person Michael truly trusted to navigate this nightmare, but Daniel's seat remained conspicuously empty. Minutes passed. The judge grew impatient, checking his watch with increasing irritation. The prosecution team exchanged knowing glances, barely concealing their satisfaction. Reporters in the gallery typed furiously on their laptops, crafting headlines about abandonment and guilt. The whispers grew louder, more cruel. Even his own lawyer won't defend him. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from tense anticipation to something darker, something that tasted of public humiliation and predetermined defeat. What nobody in that courtroom knew, what the cameras couldn't capture and the reporters couldn't report, was that at that very moment, Daniel Foster was fighting for his life. He was bound and confined in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, his hands tied, his face bruised, breathing air thick with the smell of rust and gasoline. He had been taken the night before by men whose faces he never saw, men working for interests far more powerful and far more dangerous than anyone realized. This wasn't about justice or truth. This was about ensuring that Michael Davidson would face the judge alone, defenseless, while rival businessmen and shadowy figures positioned themselves to swoop in and claim everything he had built. The judge was preparing to suspend the hearing, ready to accept the prosecution's request to keep Michael detained based on the severity of the accusations and the supposed flight risk, when something completely unexpected happened. A figure stood up from among the spectators, a woman in a simple cleaning uniform that looked entirely out of place among the expensive suits and designer dresses that filled the room. Elena Martinez's hands were shaking, but her voice came out steady and clear. She asked to speak. The entire courtroom turned to look at this invisible woman who had suddenly become the center of everything. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Officers moved toward Elena, attempting to escort her back to her seat. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, the sharp cracks cutting through the noise like gunshots. The prosecution team stood in protest, objecting to this disruption. Reporters leaned forward, cameras swinging in Elena's direction, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. But Elena refused to sit down. Her voice rose above the commotion, clear and determined in a way that surprised even herself. She said she had been at the mansion on the night of the alleged incident. She knew what time Michael had arrived home, where he had gone, how long he had stayed. She knew it was impossible for him to have been in two places at once. The judge, initially irritated by the interruption, held up his hand for silence. Something in Elena's manner made him pause. This wasn't the behavior of someone seeking attention or trying to disrupt proceedings. This was someone who knew something important, something real. He gestured for her to approach the bench. What happened next would transform Elena's life in ways she could never have imagined. The testimony that was supposed to take a few minutes stretched into hours. The judge, recognizing the potential significance of her words, allowed her to continue despite the prosecution's fierce objections. Elena spoke of the security cameras that had been disabled days before the incident, the time clock that had mysteriously stopped working, the unfamiliar technician who had never been logged in the main entrance records, the strange marks she had noticed on the mansion's electrical panel. The prosecutor tried to discredit her, suggesting she had emotional or financial reasons to protect her employer. He painted her as an opportunist, a woman looking for her moment of fame or perhaps payoff. His words were designed to make her seem small, unreliable, desperate, but Elena had spent her entire life being invisible, being overlooked and underestimated. She had learned to observe everything while appearing to see nothing. She had learned to remember details that powerful people assumed would be forgotten. If you were in Elena's place, would you have spoken up in that courtroom, knowing the danger it might bring, or would you have stayed silent to protect yourself? Tell us in the comments. The impact of her testimony rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. Court officials verified her employment history, checked her time records, interviewed other staff members. At home, Elena's mother, Rosa, watched everything unfold on the television screen, her hands gripping the phone as she called her daughter over and over, terrified that Elena had gotten involved with dangerous people, that she had put herself in harm's way by speaking truth to power. On Elena's phone, messages began to arrive. First came the insults, Anonymous voices calling her a liar, a fool, someone who didn't know her place. Then came something darker. Direct threats, warnings to stay quiet, to forget what she had seen. The streets that Elena had walked safely for years suddenly felt dangerous. A black car began appearing near her apartment building, always parked in the same spot, always with the same driver whose face showed no expression. Elena found herself looking over her shoulder constantly, jumping at unexpected sounds, lying awake at night wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. But she had come too far to turn back now. Elena had kept evidence, things she had photographed on her phone and saved to a flash drive hidden in her apartment, pictures of the disabled security system, the mysterious maintenance records, the blank time clock entries. She had documented everything without even fully understanding why, driven by an instinct that told her something was very wrong. Meanwhile, in a small office buried deep in the courthouse complex, a financial analyst named Thomas Chen was working late, cross-referencing documents that had come through official channels. Thomas was the kind of employee that institutions depended on but rarely noticed, someone who understood that the truth often hid in spreadsheets and bank statements rather than dramatic courtroom speeches. He found something that made him sit up straight in his chair, his coffee forgotten as he stared at his computer screen. There were suspicious transfers coming from a shell company connected to Richard Thornton, Michael's supposed victim and business rival. The payments had been made during the exact week of the alleged incident, and more interestingly, on the night that Daniel Foster, Michael's attorney, had disappeared. Thomas dug deeper, following the money trail with the patience of someone who understood that financial crimes left paper trails for those willing to look closely enough. He found hotel records showing Richard Thornton checking into a luxury suite across town during the time he claimed to have been incapacitated and unable to conduct business. The timestamps didn't match the official story. The medical records seemed incomplete, missing crucial details that should have been there if the incident had occurred as described. Thomas made a decision. He reached out to Elena through official channels, warning her that what she had brought to light might be just the beginning, that this case involved not just one false accusation, but a web of corruption that included contract fraud, witness manipulation, and the systematic destruction of a man's reputation to serve the interests of people who operated in shadows. The judge, feeling the pressure from both the media spotlight and the growing evidence of inconsistencies, began to see cracks in what had seemed like an airtight case. The prosecution's narrative, which had been so convincing in the beginning, started to crumble under scrutiny. Michael's absence of his attorney, which had seemed like abandonment or cowardice, now appeared suspicious in a different way. The security system failures, the timeline discrepancies, the financial irregularities, all of it pointed towards something orchestrated and deliberate. But power doesn't surrender easily. The prosecution pushed back hard, insisting on maintaining the original charges. Behind the scenes, there were phone calls between offices, conversations in hallways that weren't recorded, pressure applied in ways that left no fingerprints. Within the system itself, someone was feeding information to the people who had engineered Michael's downfall, someone who had been bought and paid for to ensure that truth remained buried. As Elena's testimony gained traction, the investigation took on new dimensions. A discreet police detective named Sarah Williams was assigned to protect Elena after the threats became impossible to ignore. Sarah was experienced enough to recognize when something bigger was at play, when the pieces on the board didn't move in expected ways. She noticed immediately that information about Elena's whereabouts seemed to leak before security measures could be properly implemented. Someone inside the system was working against them. The black car that had been following Elena disappeared one day, only to be replaced by more subtle surveillance. Sarah documented everything, building her own case within the case, understanding that the conspiracy extended far beyond what anyone had initially realized. She began to suspect that the people behind Michael's false accusation had connections that reached into law enforcement itself, into the courts, into places where justice was supposed to be sacrosanct. Miles away from the courtroom drama, in that abandoned warehouse where daylight barely penetrated through broken windows, Daniel Foster was fighting his own battle. The men who held him weren't common criminals. They were professionals, hired to do a specific job, to keep him away from the courtroom at the critical moment when Michael would need him most. But even professionals make mistakes, and Daniel was trained to watch for them. One of his captors, a younger man who seemed less hardened than the others, began to show signs of doubt. During the long hours of confinement, Daniel talked to him, not as a lawyer, but as one human being to another. He learned that the young man, whose name was Jake, had been promised easy money for what was supposed to be a simple job. Jake was starting to understand that he had become part of something far more serious, something that could destroy not just Michael Davidson, but everyone who got caught in its machinery. Daniel discovered through Jake's unguarded comments that there was someone coordinating everything from a distance, someone whose identity even the men holding him didn't know. Orders came through encrypted messages, payments were made through untraceable channels. The operation was designed with layers of protection, ensuring that if anything went wrong, the people at the top would remain untouchable. Back in Chicago's legal district, Thomas Chen continued his meticulous investigation of the financial records. What he uncovered painted a disturbing picture. Richard Thornton, the supposed victim, had received massive transfers from overseas accounts in the weeks leading up to the accusations. Companies that had been on the verge of signing contracts with Davidson Industries suddenly pulled back, redirecting their business to Thornton's enterprises. Stock prices had been manipulated with surgical precision, benefiting a small group of investors who seemed to know exactly when to buy and sell. Thomas brought his findings to Elena and Detective Williams in a secure location, a coffee shop far from the courthouse where they were less likely to be observed. He spread printouts across the table, his finger tracing the money trails that connected shell companies, offshore accounts, and powerful business interests. The scheme was elegant in its complexity, designed to transfer not just Michael's wealth, but his entire business empire to a group of conspirators who had been planning this takeover for months. Elena listened, her coffee growing cold as the magnitude of what she had stumbled into became clear. She had thought she was simply telling the truth about her employer's whereabouts on one particular night. She hadn't realized she was standing against an entire network of corruption that had resources, connections, and a willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened their plans. Meanwhile, the courtroom proceedings continued with increasing tension. Judge Raymond Harrison, a man with 30 years on the bench, found himself navigating waters he had never encountered before. The pressure from above was intense. There were suggestions, carefully worded, that perhaps this case should be handled differently, that perhaps the original narrative should be maintained for the sake of public confidence in the system. But Judge Harrison had built his career on integrity, and he recognized that this case had become a test of whether justice meant anything at all when powerful interests were at stake. He ordered a comprehensive review of all evidence, including the new financial documents that Thomas had uncovered. He authorized an investigation into Daniel Foster's disappearance, which was now being treated not as abandonment, but as a potential interference with legal proceedings. He issued protective orders for Elena and demanded answers about the surveillance and threats she had received. The prosecution team, led by ambitious District Attorney Marcus Webb, fought every step. Webb had built his political career on high-profile convictions, and Michael Davidson's case was supposed to be his crowning achievement, his ticket to higher office. The thought of this case unraveling, of being revealed as either incompetent or complicit, drove him to increasingly desperate measures. He held press conferences attacking Elena's credibility, questioning Judge Harrison's impartiality, suggesting that powerful interests were trying to subvert justice. But the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Security experts testified about the disabled cameras and manipulated systems at Michael's mansion. Financial analysts explained the suspicious transfers and the coordinated business maneuvers. Hotel staff confirmed Richard Thornton's presence at times when he claimed to be incapacitated. The perfect case that had seemed so solid began to look like a house of cards built on lies and manipulation. In his cell, Michael Davidson experienced something he had never felt before in his privileged life: complete powerlessness. He who had always controlled situations with money and influence found himself dependent on the courage of a housekeeper he barely knew, on the integrity of a judge who had no reason to trust him, on investigators who were risking their own careers by digging too deep. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be truly vulnerable, to have your fate rest in hands other than your own. Eleanor, sitting in a safe house with Detective Williams standing guard, stared at her phone. Messages from reporters offering money for exclusive interviews, calls from lawyers suggesting lawsuits and settlements, texts from people she hadn't heard from in years, suddenly interested in her life, and somewhere in all that noise, a growing realization that she could never go back to being invisible, that speaking the truth had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jake, the young man who had been guarding Daniel Foster, made a choice that would alter everything. Late one night, when his partners were distracted, he loosened Daniel's restraints and left a phone, where the attorney could reach it. The message was simple but clear. Jake couldn't live with what they were doing. He couldn't be part of destroying an innocent man's life for money he would probably never see anyway. Daniel's call to the police led to a rapid response team that descended on the warehouse at dawn. He was found exhausted, dehydrated, but alive, with information that would prove crucial to understanding the full scope of the conspiracy. He knew the timing of his abduction, the voices he had heard discussing the courtroom proceedings, the admission from one of his captors, that this had all been carefully orchestrated to leave Michael defenseless at the critical moment. The rescue made national headlines. The story that had begun as the downfall of a wealthy businessman had transformed into something far more complex and disturbing. A tale of conspiracy, corruption, and the courage of ordinary people standing against extraordinary power. In the courtroom, the final hearing was standing room only. Every major news network had cameras present. Judge Harrison entered with documents that represented weeks of intensive investigation. The atmosphere was electric, everyone understanding that they were witnessing something significant, a moment when the system would either prove its integrity or reveal its compromise. The presentation of evidence took hours. Financial experts detailed the money trails that connected Richard Thornton to the shell companies that had funded the entire operation. Security specialists explained how the surveillance systems at Michael's mansion had been deliberately sabotaged to create gaps in the timeline. Medical professionals reviewed Richard's supposed injuries and found inconsistencies that should have been caught immediately but had been overlooked in the rush to prosecution. Daniel Foster, still showing the physical effects of his ordeal, testified about his abduction and what he had learned during his captivity. His words carried weight not just because of his legal expertise, but because his suffering made the conspiracy real in ways that documents and financial records could not. Elena was called to testify again, and this time her words were heard differently. What had initially been dismissed as the confused observations of a domestic worker was now recognized as the careful attention of someone who had seen what others had deliberately hidden. Her testimony about the disabled security systems, the mysterious technician, the timeline of Michael's movements on the critical night, all of it fit perfectly with the larger pattern of manipulation that had been uncovered. Judge Harrison's ruling was comprehensive and devastating to the prosecution. He declared that there was insufficient evidence to support the charges against Michael Davidson and substantial evidence suggesting he had been the victim of a coordinated conspiracy. He ordered Michael's immediate release and directed that a new investigation be opened into Richard Thornton, his business associates, and anyone who had participated in the scheme, including those within the system who had facilitated the false prosecution. The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered. Others shouted in anger. District Attorney Marcus Webb sat stunned, his political ambitions crashing down around him as reporters began asking questions about his failure to properly investigate the case. Richard Thornton, who had attended the hearing with the confidence of a man certain of his victory, found himself surrounded by federal agents as warrants were served for his arrest on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and witness intimidation. The aftermath was swift and brutal for the conspirators. Companies lost value overnight as their connections to the scandal were revealed. Business partners who had stood beside Richard now claimed they had known nothing. The network of corruption that had seemed so powerful began to disintegrate as people scrambled to save themselves, each one willing to provide information in exchange for leniency. Michael Davidson walked out of the courthouse a free man, but not the same man who had entered weeks before. He found Elena waiting outside, surrounded by cameras and microphones that she still didn't quite know how to handle. Their eyes met across the crowd, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond gratitude or obligation. He had been saved not by expensive lawyers or political connections, but by a housekeeper who could have chosen silence and safety, but had instead chosen truth. For Elena, life would never return to what it had been. The offers poured in, job opportunities, interview requests, even a book deal. But she still wore the same uniform, still took the same crowded bus, still checked on her mother every morning before leaving for work. The difference was internal. She had discovered that her voice, so long accustomed to being unheard, possessed a power she had never imagined. She had stood in a courtroom full of powerful people and changed the course of multiple lives with nothing but the truth. Michael kept his promises. To ensure Elena's protection, her mother's medical care and her security. But more than that, he began to see the thousands of people who worked in his companies not as invisible labor, but as individuals whose observations, whose voices, whose dignity mattered. The experience had humbled him in ways that success never could. Detective Sarah Williams received a commendation for her work, though she knew the real story would never be fully told, the story of how deep the corruption had run and how close they had come to letting it succeed. Thomas Chen, the quiet analyst who had followed the money trails, found himself recruited to a special task force investigating corporate fraud, his skills finally recognized and valued. And somewhere in Chicago, in a small apartment on the south side, Eleanor sat with her mother and watched the evening news. The reporters were still talking about the case, about justice served and truth prevailing. Rosa held her daughter's hand, no longer afraid, now proud beyond words. Eleanor had become something she never intended to be, a symbol of what one person could do when they chose courage over convenience, truth over safety. The conspiracy had failed, but its lessons remained. Power would always seek to protect itself. Truth would always need defenders. And sometimes those defenders would come from the most unexpected places, wearing yellow uniforms and riding crowded buses, seeing everything while being seen by no one, until the moment when their voice became the one that mattered most. Dear listeners, we hope Michael and Elena's story touched your heart. If you were moved by this tale of courage, justice, and the power of speaking truth, click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what resonated with you most. Would you have had the courage to speak up like Elena did? Every day we bring you intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest side of the human soul and the extraordinary things ordinary people can do. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode.